You just heard Reverberation from the 13th Floor Elevators. In the opening segment, just so that you have a point of reference, you heard the song Roller Coaster by the 13th Floor Elevators as well. Would have been the first track in the montage. So two little snippets right there. The 13th Floor Elevators, this is their first album, and boy, is it an interesting story, both pre-album, during album, and then a little bit down the road on the 13th Floor Elevators. And it is the only time we're going to be covering them. So I am going to talk a little bit about the postscript of this album. But before I do that, familiarity with the 13th Floor Elevators, and for that matter, psychedelic rock. Josh, coming in, where were you?
This whole podcast is my primer into psychedelic rock, other than maybe, I don't know, Jimi Hendrix or something, if you consider him psych rock, which probably not. But I definitely recognized this first track from the album, but I did not know the band.
Okay. Where did you, out of curiosity, where did you know the song from?
I don't know. I must have heard it somewhere. Maybe from a movie or...
Deep in your subconscious?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely rung a bell somewhere.
How apropos.
I was about to say, that's where I went there. It was, perhaps it was a trip gone by that maybe you knew this song.
Past life.
Yeah. Exactly. How about you, Matt? What's your familiarity with psychedelic rock and, for that matter, the 13th Floor Elevators?
Well, some familiarity with psychedelic rock. We're going to cover Pink Floyd's "Piper at the Gates of Dawn." That might be the most psych rock, 60s psych rock album that I was familiar with. Sure. You know, certain songs like 8 Miles High. We talked about the Byrds. Mm-hmm. You know, but with these guys, nothing. I didn't recognize one song. Never heard of them before we got into this. So this was all brand new to me.
Well, it's interesting you say that because most people consider this to be the first album of what is considered to be psychedelic rock. There are some people that will challenge that, but the general consensus seems to be that this album represents the first full album recording of psychedelic rock as seen in America. So,
out of curiosity, the people that challenge that, is there another album in particular that rivals this, or that is...
You know, as a guy who likes metal, right, there's always people that instead of going to the bands that actually start to sound like metal, you know, for example, if you did, you know, Black Sabbath or Zeppelin or, you know, King Crimson, right, bands that you can definitely draw a line to metal, there will always be people that were like, well, you know, the Beatles were doing metal, and they weren't, you know what I mean? But it's like those type of people, you know what I mean? It's like, no, we don't have to squint that hard to find it. Let's just, the easiest answer is sometimes the best, right? You know,
right?
It's like, you know, Blondie did rap before people did it in the 80s. It's like, come on, you know?
Yeah, I just didn't know if there was like another album that was kind of like right around the same time that there's a story behind that, but it doesn't sound like that's the case. It's just people spouting off what they feel like should be it.
John, do you have a working definition of what psychedelic rock consists of?
It's hard to totally. First of all, you have to understand that psychedelic rock was a lifestyle, which we're going to talk about. And while it's a stereotype to talk about drugs and psychedelic rock, in this case, it is a true stereotype because a big piece of it was taking mind-altering drugs, specifically LSD, but basically anything that could change your consciousness, and playing rock and roll that was more free-form, often had non-traditional instrumentation, which we'll talk about on this album for sure, longer guitar solos, and basically the idea is that the rock was designed for you to hear sounds and evoke emotions that would allow you to sort of go into your subconscious. And we're going to talk about the 13th Floor Elevators sort of had an ethos for how they imagined their albums to be, basically a gateway into exploration of your mind.
So, not just hear sounds, but see sounds, probably.
Well, it's difficult because a lot of psychedelic rock sounds very different. Even this album compared to the album we're going to cover later by the United States of America, right? They're in the framework of psychedelic rock to some degree, but they're very different albums, in my opinion. I don't know if you guys would disagree with that or agree with that, but for me, they are.
I would agree. I think they're different.
I would agree with that as well. Yeah.
Well, and early Pink Floyd, you know, while sharing some characteristics, I don't think sounds very much like the 13th Floor Elevators. And then when you get into later psychedelic rock in the 70s and the 80s, you know, you start getting other in the 80s, you have the Psychedelic Furs and, bands like that. In the 70s, there was an underground psychedelic scene, but then it even started to, show itself in things like Blue Oyster Cult, you know what I mean, had elements of psychedelia. And that was like very mainstream psychedelia, right? So it kind of went from being a subculture to a style of music that was guitar driven, stretched out, longer compositions. The vocals were often a combination of either soothing or chaotic, which I mean, no better example of that than this album for the chaotic. And then the United States of America would probably fall more in the soothing area, but I don't want to jump on.
I'd throw the production in there too, because I think that there are certainly distinctive styles within the production that, at least in this album, is to me was very lo-fi, very muted.
Oh, it's bare bones for sure by design. Yeah.
So I think that probably, it plays a part of it as well. It's a whole bunch of things, I think, but it's also one of those things that's easier to know it when you hear it rather than to actually describe it. It's kind of like a lot of ways it's just like a feel. I think. Anyway.
And what I'll do, Josh, too, is in between segments, or maybe even for cleaning the stacks next week, I'll try to get a working definition of psychedelic rock for the listeners, just so that we can officially put that one to bed. But it is.
Yeah, I think it would just be helpful for people that don't know. I mean, obviously they could Google it. But
well, here you go. Also. Psychedelic rock, also referred to as psychedelia, is a diverse style of rock music inspired, influenced, or representative of psychedelic culture, which is centered on perception-altering hallucinogenic drugs.
There you go.
Music
I didn't even look that up, Matt. So there you go.
Music is intended to replicate and enhance the mind-altering experience of drugs, most notably LSD. So
I should write for Wikipedia, man. That was pretty good, right? Off top of my head.
John.
Yeah. So. But yeah, I like I said, I think it's less of a distinguishable sound and more of a subculture that has elements at time. But there aren't a lot of people playing an electric jug, or by a lot I mean any, besides the 13th floor elevators.
Yeah,
so
I'm glad that.
Yep. So I don't want to give away too much.
The electric jug.
Well, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that because I think we're all going to be of the same opinion of that. But let me give some quick notes about this band because they're a fascinating band. So they were mostly from the state of Texas. They spent a little bit of time in San Francisco right around the time they were making their first album. And then they moved back to Texas and were stationed out of the Austin, Texas area. The band members were Roky Erickson is on vocals, and he has a very distinctive vocal style that almost sounds like one of those things where this is how I describe it, guys. You tell me if this is an accurate description. When you would see people at drum circles sort of screaming out their angst and their deep embedded feelings, and sort of that wailing sound that you have is very similar to Mr. Erickson's vocals. Would you concur with that, or would you describe it a different way?
I don't know if I haven't been around a lot of drum circles, oddly enough. I actually thought some of the yelling parts of that were somewhat, and not exactly by any stretch, but it reminded me a little bit of Robert Plant.
Okay. Could see that.
Yeah, I thought of the Rolling Stones a lot, actually, listening to this album for some reason.
That's why.
I would agree with that. Not with the shouting so much, but I think when he was just because I did like his voice a lot. I liked Erickson's voice. I thought it was a very strong vocal performance. But I agree, Josh. I could hear Mick Jagger doing some of the styles that he was doing. Not necessarily the screeching, howling stuff that he was doing, but the regular singing. I can picture that.
To me, it was a lot of like early garage rock mixed with almost like what's become a cliche of like, like type sounds like over and over again. But I think almost designed to be a feral sound. And I think that's what he was going for. And so Mr. Erickson, very unique vocals. They then had Stacey Sutherland on the lead guitar. They had Benny Thurman on bass. They had the well-named John Walton on drums. And on the electric jug and as the lyricist, and spoiler alert, the lyrics seem like an LSD diary on this entire album, Tommy Hall, who is quite the character. So let me
He's the jug player too, isn't he?
He is only the jug player, yes. He's the lyricist, and he writes the lyrics, and he plays the electric jug. Yes, that is his two pieces of the band. So here's how the band comes together. Sutherland meets Walton at a diner, where they have a conversation in the parking lot and become friends, okay? And this story is recounted in nearly every bio of the 13th floor elevators, so it's kind of like their origin story is is key, okay? So then they recruit Benny Thurman, who's also in Texas, who's both a violinist, but he's also a bassist. So they say, hey, can you play the bass? Yeah, sounds good. So the three of them are together. At the same time, Tommy Hall, our electric jug player, is a student at UT in Austin, and he's studying chemical engineering and psychology. Not surprisingly, three of these four people, Walton being the exception, were doing, as I would euphemistically describe it, a shit ton of peyote and LSD. It's the fact that even Tommy Hall says that he was involved in LSD experiments on UT's campus. Now, no proof of this exists, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, because they're not going to release that information because of human subjects. So, yes, they all bond, besides musicianship, over the fact that they were doing tons and tons of mind-altering substances. Apparently, Walton swore off of these drugs because of the fact that he had a bad trip the first time he did it, and he was not game. And actually, it would be a big piece of the reason why he would leave the band later, because he just felt that the lifestyle was too much a part of the band. Okay, so Sutherland goes to Austin. He becomes involved both in the music scene and the drug scene there. That's where he meets Hall. And then he says, hey, we should put a band together. And he goes, that's fantastic, because I've got these other guys. So Walton and Thurman come along to form the band. And then, meanwhile, our friend Mr. Erickson is in a band named The Spades, and he is the lead singer. And they like the way he sounds, and they decide to steal him from that band. And there you go. The 13th Floor Elevators are born. Now, the 13th Floor Elevators are then named by, most people say, Mr. Walton, for a couple different reasons. They are named after the floor that the elevator, never is not on the elevator in most buildings, right? That I think most people know that a lot of places don't put the 13th floor. Because it's unlucky, right? But also, M is the 13th letter of the alphabet, which is M. And M also stands for marijuana, another drug that they love. And so it's thought that that is another reason that they picked it.
Of course.
Say what you... Yes, okay. So once again, like I said, it is impossible to detach the drug-taking habits of this band from the music that they made. So anyway, they are playing, and they get a little bit of a buzz, and they are signed by something that is highly unusual in the 60s, and that is what we would consider to be an independent label in the 60s, and that is International Artist Records in Austin. And that also probably explains why the production on this album is bare bones, to say the least, because probably there was not a lot of money coming into International Artist Records, coffers. So this isn't like, and then the artist signed with Columbia, like we hear so often, during our stuff here. This is, they signed with basically an indie level. Okay, so the Elevators were also known for, with the exception of Walton, as we mentioned earlier, doing every rehearsal, performance, and recording session under the influence of LSD. That was a key piece that is there. They, there's a lot of different funny stories about them. One of the ones I liked most is they end up on American Bandstand 2 different times, and at one point Dick Clark turns to Tommy Hall and asks who the head man of the group is, and he deadpans to him, well, we're all heads, which made me laugh pretty loud.
Yeah, that's on. Actually, I saw that. That is on YouTube. You can watch that performance and that interview on YouTube.
Yes, it's pretty fantastic. I was about to direct people there, but yeah, if you want to see it, it will give you an ethos of the band. Not surprisingly, as they're going out on their first tour, 4 of the 5 members of the band are busted for possession of pot, and so they're facing jail time as they're basically pushing their opening album. Somehow during this time, they end up in San Francisco, they're playing, and they get to meet back up with Janis Joplin, who they were friends with in Austin. And she almost thinks about joining the band before deciding not to, and instead joining another outfit known as Big Brother and the Holding Company, which will tie you back to episode 1 of our journey through Combing the Stacks. There's a little bit more at the end that they're there, but let's talk about this album. I didn't even touch on the Electric Jug yet. Matt, what were your thoughts on this album?
I'm not a fan of this album, really. I like how it starts. I think the first 2 songs for me are probably the ones that I like the most, the strongest tracks.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, and You're Gonna Miss Me is that's the single, correct, John?
As much as that album had I don't know. Yes, it was called the single, but I don't think that they were pushing it.
And that's the one that you heard, right, Josh? Like somehow, somewhere, in an LSD fit of yours. So I thought that was I was like, oh, this is cool. I like the sound of this. You know, psychedelic music that I've heard in the past, I've liked, and I find it interesting. Roller Coaster, I liked. I thought that just the opening guitar part for that song, I think is probably my favorite moment on the album. It just starts off with this really eerie guitar plucking, kind of like it's menacing, you know, and it's like in this minor key, and it's got a very cool eerie sound to it. But even though I struggle to say that's my favorite song of the album, because this Electric Jug is it's all over the place on this album.
Permeates the album, yes.
It's too much. It doesn't need to be there at all, I don't think. Maybe once or twice for like a measure, but it's far too prevalent.
I'm glad we're all on the same page with this, because I was worried that somebody would love the Electric Jug or something, and then I'd have to defend my feelings on that.
It's annoying. It's just this. It's kind of like this irritation that permeates most of. It's not on everything. Like kind of the slower songs, like this third song, Splash One. It's not really there at all, I don't think. But I don't like that. I think it's invasive for a lot of the music that's on here. But even if they did do away with that, to me the songs just aren't there. It's just kind of, it's fine. I didn't hate it, but I can't say that I really liked it or that I was really, you know, I've listened to it many, many times. You know, and it's not even like the psychedelic nature in and of itself turns me off, or the lyrics. You know, a lot of this is like, you know, just escaping your mind and the kingdom of heaven is within you. And it's just, I didn't find much out of this. I wanted to, but it's just, aside from those first two songs, there's moments here and there. I think that through the rhythm, it's got like a heavy, prominent bass line. That was kind of cool. And so there's parts like that throughout the album that I think, okay, they're doing a little cool thing here and there, but this was not something really getting.
Yeah, okay. I feel the same way. I thought this album, I couldn't get past the Electric Jug. Like it was distracting to the point of like, I kept thinking this whole album would be better if they just somehow removed the Electric Jug from it and like re-released it. I thought it was a really good like garage rock sounding album, taking the Electric Jug out of the equation. But even towards like the back half, I felt that it was kind of droning on and sounding the same. There wasn't even much variety in terms of the songs or direction in the album. I did like that song Fire Engine, also, in addition to the first two. Those were kind of my three strong highlights.
But I always think that production level is just, and I get why they did it. And sometimes I'm okay with that, but it didn't really do this album any favors, I don't think. And like Josh, I think it did kind of, that's a word we've been using in this. It's got a sameness to it, even though there's some slow songs and some fast songs and some different things going on. But it kind of overall just blended together for me. And I just didn't really find, there weren't enough hooks for me, I guess, you know, things that really I gravitated towards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't say I disagree with you guys. I thought especially toward the end, it really, just in the notes I made, I said, this is a very slow and plodding track. One thing I want to mention is, boy, is this recorded in a mono style, very mono. And when you're doing what they're trying to do with the complexity, we talked about Brian Wilson earlier and all the pieces he had and stuff. And in this case, it probably would have been welcomed a little bit more production, because I do think a little bit more nuance. There's songs where the bass, while good, is just turned up way higher than the rest of the track. I said on a couple different songs, it feels like the bass and the drums were recorded in separate rooms, and I had no evidence that was the case. So, but clearly and demonstrably, they sounded like two different recordings. Along with the Electric Jug, I would say I was not a huge fan of Erickson's vocals, and the lyrics themselves were, you know, they were like Jim Morrison at his worst level obscure, you know. And not really telling a story, just sort of like the musings of someone who is under the influence. I did like the bass lines. As Josh said, it had elements where it was a good garage rock album, but I just felt like it went a little bit too long. The electric jug, I just didn't see why it needed to be there, and I'll kind of explain what the electric jug sound is in a second. I just would have liked a more traditional singer on this.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, the electric jug, because when I did read about that, and before I listened to this album, and I was intrigued. I was like, oh, that's cool. You know, kind of like the 6-string electric banjo that we talked about with the Monks, right, John? So you hear this kind of description of an instrument and you go, that's interesting. I wonder what that's like. And then I would rather not know what the electric jug is than having to,
does that lead you to want to hear Cheap Trick and the keytar? You know what I mean? Does seeing the keytar make you want to hear it? You know what I mean? Or is
at
it
least
just sort
the
of like
keytar sounds like keyboards, it's just like, this is just, I don't know what's a whistle? Like, how would you describe this, John?
Well, here's how it's described in terms of the official definition. The jug, a crock jug with a microphone held up to it while it was being blown, sounded somewhat like a cross between a mini Moog synthesizer and I don't even know how to pronounce this word, so I apologize, but a CUICA drum. A kuka drum, perhaps? In contrast to traditional musical jug... I love this. In contrast to traditional musical jug technique, which I will be fully honest in saying I do not have the nuance for our listeners. I apologize. I'm showing my
it's like what the
limitations.
It's like what the Big Bear did in the Country Bear Jamboree in Disney World, right?
That's like the jug. Yeah. Yes.
Go watch
so
that.
as opposed to that traditional technique as referenced by the bear in the hillbilly exhibit, Hall did not blow into the jug to produce a tuba-like sound. Instead, he vocalized musical runs into the mouth of the jug, using the jug to create echo and distortion of his voice. While playing live, he held up the microphone to the mouth of the jug to emphasize the sound of it, which is probably why, as I believe the word Matt used that is correct here, is invasive. And to use that in a sentence, an invasive species took over the swamp. And that's how I thought about this sound on this album, an invasive species taking over this album. So God bless Mr. Hall. Perhaps if I listened to this album under the influence of mind-altering drugs, I might have a different take. The musicianship was fine, but when we've listened to, for example, The Animals as a garage rock band and some of the production we've heard and different stuff like that, I just don't know if this one holds up.
Yeah, I mean, considering this album is only 35 minutes, we're complaining about how it drones on and there's not enough variety and stuff. That's saying something, I think.
Yeah, and go ahead. I'm sorry, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, even if the jug was in there sparsely, it's like, okay, all right, you're doing something different. It's, all right, I get it. You're on drugs and you're trying to do something cool. I appreciate I'd never heard that before, right? But it's all over the place. And it's just like, really? Like, I don't know. It's not for me.
Well, and I will say that I do like 4 songs on it, and they're the first 4 songs, believe it or not. So, You're Gonna Miss Me, I would say, sounds like a Stones song if it included psychedelic elements, for sure. And I think that's where probably Josh and Matt were picking up the Mick Jagger vibe, because it definitely has a Stones sound to it. Track 2, Roller Coaster, is sort of like that Jesus and Mary Chain Ravenette sound, if you're familiar with those two bands, with the cascading drums. And so I actually really like that track. Splash 1, I described as like a psychedelic Frankie Avalon song. And then track 4, Reverberation, has a ton of bass line in the front and the most singing of a song that's not wailing. It's more traditionally sung. So I was feeling this album for the first 4, but then it starts to get repetitive. The jug takes over and the production falls off the cliff a little bit. So I would say there is stuff to listen to, especially on the front end, that you might like. And it certainly isn't a bad album. I just don't know. We've been listening to so many ones that are strong recently. I just don't know if it holds up.
Is this the most prominent use of electric jug on an album that either in the history of music? I wonder. I'm
not aware of anyone else who uses it in terms of my research. It basically stands out as the thing that everybody mentions. Besides their origin story, the electric jug is basically the number 2 thing that gets mentioned about this band all the time. Real quick, as a postscript, in case you're wondering how things turned out for the 13th floor elevators. Eventually, Erickson ends up in jail for possession of 1 joint, is basically what they say, a different possession charge than that marijuana one earlier. He pleads insanity and ends up in a mental hospital. He tries to escape on several occasions, and even at one point, Hall and some friends attempt to break him out of the facility. However, it does
Jeez.
take a sad turn because he's moved to a prison for the criminally insane, where he receives shock treatments that pretty much for, going all the way into the 2000s, they're still trying to right the ship for Erickson. He actually becomes kind of a cult figure, and people like Johnny Depp become huge fans of the 13th floor elevators. And pretty much people are trying to pull him out of the abyss all the way up until the 2000s. Sutherland eventually dies being shot to death by his wife after a domestic dispute in the late 70s. The rest of the band, end up pretty much leaving after the third album. Especially Erickson and Hall become sort of disinterested with the band, so they leave. And the band is kind of off the face, off the charts and also out of the mainstream by about 1970. So it's kind of a sad postscript, but I guess that goes back to my take is nothing good's going to come from day after day taking psychedelic drugs every day. Even if you do reach the non-Aristotelian consciousness that apparently was being posited by Mr. Hall.
Oh, I remember I had that back in 2002. So that was the
Aristotelian. Excuse me, Aristotelian. I guess not the Aristotelian view of life. Yes.
The other thing that made me laugh, I was reminded back to the Monks episode where the managers wrote out the laws for the rules for the band, and I wonder, it sounded like you must always take LSD whenever on
I don't
stage
think anybody needed to make that a rule. I think they were doing that on their own, and it just happened to fit well with the ethos. So it sounds like what I'm saying is feel free to check it out if you like psychedelic rock or you're in the mood for something new, but definitely not a must grab.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely, I like the couple songs on here. They're worth checking out. I'll have to find out where I've heard that song from too.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I did read that was a single, but yeah, for me, I think that this is one of those things that my own opinion is that this probably made this list because of the historical context that it was, widely considered the first psychedelic rock album. And I think that there should be some credit there, for, being influential. But in terms of an overall listen, if you want to just sit down and enjoy an album, I can't recommend this. I would say probably just go other places and you'll get a better listen. There are maybe the first couple songs, maybe, but this you can skip over this as far as I'm concerned.